Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating. It's this incredibly universal, yet kind of completely unspoken human experience. We're going to unpack the psychology and the philosophy behind a very specific moment. Why, every so often, we catch our own reflection and literally do not recognize the person looking back at us. It's an explainer that sits right at the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and just those quiet, weird moments of everyday life.
You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's that hyper-specific, sudden wave of vertigo. You're just going about your day, minding your own business, and boom, you catch a glimpse of someone, and for just a fraction of a second, your brain scrambles to put the pieces together. You literally think to yourself, wait, who is that? And then finally, the loop completes, and you realize, oh, it's me. It's this sudden jarring disconnect right before your brain bridges the gap between what you expected to see and what's actually standing right there.
And honestly, the craziest part is where this happens, because it's almost never when you're posing for a photo or intentionally staring into a dressing room mirror. It strikes in the most completely mundane moments. You glance down at the dark, locked screen of your phone held at just the wrong angle. You're walking past a shop window on a crowded street, or you flip the light switch in the bathroom of a friend's apartment. In those totally unguarded, passing moments, for just a split second, you lock eyes with a total stranger. And sometimes, as our source material points out, you aren't entirely sure that recognizing yourself is actually an improvement.
All right, Section 1, the looking glass self.
Okay, let's really dive into this. To understand why this glitch happens, we kind of have to look at how we build our sense of identity in the first place. Because identity isn't just this static object we keep hidden in our pockets. Way back in 1902, the sociologist Charles Cooley came up with this brilliant concept called the looking glass self. The core idea here is that our sense of who we are isn't actually generated entirely from within. Instead, it's largely built by imagining how other people perceive us. We look at the reflection other people give us, through their reactions, their words, their body language, and we construct our identity out of that feedback. We assume identity is just a thing we carry around, but really, it's something we perform. We are constantly performing our identity for an audience.
Let's look at how this builds. Cooley was talking about a social mirror, that comforting, slow accumulation of other people's regard that basically tells us who we are in the world. But the mirror we are talking about today, the literal, physical piece of glass, that one is way more treacherous. Because when you look into a physical mirror, you suddenly become your own audience. You are evaluating the performer, and sometimes the performance you see just does not match the script you thought you were reading from.
Which brings us to Section 2, the ship of Theseus.
So how exactly does this massive disconnect happen? How do we drift so far from our own physical reflection? Well, this brings us to the philosophical mechanics of how we change over time. Philosophers have basically been arguing about this for centuries using this classic thought experiment, the ship of Theseus. Imagine a wooden ship. Over the years, as the planks rot, you replace them one by one with brand new wood. Eventually, every single original plank has been swapped out. So, is it still the exact same ship? Now, for objects, this is just a fun little academic puzzle. But for humans, as our source notes so beautifully, it is something we actively live inside of. We are the ship.
Because, let's be real, human change rarely arrives in some giant cinematic event. More often, it comes as a series of incredibly small, quiet little substitutions. You pick up a new habit here, you abandon an outdated belief there. A new relationship subtly rewires the exact way you walk into a room or hold your shoulders. You're replacing your own planks, one by one, and you don't even notice yourself becoming someone else entirely, simply because, well, you're just too busy living your life to notice the swaps.
And then, bam, one random morning, the light in the bathroom hits you weirdly. You look up, and there it is, the sudden gap. That glaring discontinuity between the self you fully expected to see in your mind's eye and the actual, physical self standing right there in the glass. Sometimes this gap is just a tiny sliver, you barely even notice it. But other times, it can literally feel like this massive canyon that you have absolutely zero memory of crossing.
Moving on to Section 3, identity disruption in fiction.
And this brilliantly illustrates the true psychological weight of what we're talking about here. Catching a stranger in the mirror isn't just about getting older or getting a bad haircut, it's a legit psychological event. Psychologists actually have a term for this, identity disruption. It's that super unsettling feeling that your core sense of who you are has just been fundamentally destabilized. Now, usually this happens around massive life transitions. We're talking grief, divorce, moving to a new country, retiring. But what's really surprising is that identity disruption can also just accumulate quietly. It doesn't need some dramatic, life-altering cause. It can happen purely through the slow drift of time, just doing exactly what time does.
There's this striking realization from a friend of the author that just totally nails this feeling. They said, "I woke up one day and realized I had stopped being the person all my stories were about." Wow. Isn't that incredibly powerful? It isn't necessarily a tragedy, right? But there is this very quiet mourning in it, a mourning for coherence, for the loss of feeling like this continuous, unbroken self with a shape you can just immediately recognize.
To really make sense of this, we can look to the philosopher Derek Parfit. He argued that our personal identity, this core self we cling to so tightly, actually isn't a fixed, solid thing at all. Instead, it's a really useful fiction. It's a narrative we actively write in our minds to make sense of the continuity between the person we were 10 years ago and the person we are right now. So the really crucial point here is, if Parfit is right, the mirror is simply reflecting that fragile fiction right back at us. And let's face it, some days that fiction is a whole lot harder to maintain.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we can completely reframe the experience. It's so easy to look in the mirror, see a stranger, and feel like, wow, I have totally failed at knowing myself. But perhaps that stranger isn't a failure at all. Perhaps the stranger in the mirror is simply rock-solid evidence that you are still in motion. You are still becoming, you are still unresolved. You haven't hardened into stone just yet.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 4, the value of the pause.
So, what do we actually do with this stranger? When that moment of vertigo hits, what is the real-world, actionable takeaway for us? Well, generally, we fall into one of two extremes, and honestly, neither of them is great. The first is what we'll call forcing recognition. We insist on continuity where there really isn't any, trying to perform a version of ourselves that just no longer fits, kind of like wearing a skin we've completely outgrown. It is exhausting, and frankly, it's dishonest. The other extreme is pure acceptance, that supermodern wisdom that tells us all change is inherently good. But that's dangerous too, right? Because sometimes the person in the mirror is a self you drifted into completely by accident, maybe through pure inertia or just avoiding hard choices. Sometimes that stranger actually deserves a little bit of your scrutiny.
The ultimate philosophical takeaway here, the absolute sweet spot between forcing it and completely ignoring it, is finding the profound power of the pause itself. There is so much value in that tiny, split fraction of a second right before your brain completes the loop of recognition.
I want you to really slow down and think about the pacing of that moment. It is such a unique, weird little space. For literally 1 second, you are not who you remember being. But you are also not quite yet the person you are becoming. It is this incredibly uncomfortable, entirely neutral space. It is the one single place where your change is entirely visible, but your brain hasn't had the time to rationalize it all away yet. So the actual practice the author suggests is to just start looking a little bit longer. Not out of vanity, but to practice sitting in that discomfort. When you catch that random reflection, try staying in the gap for just one extra beat before you mentally close it. Let the stranger be a stranger for just one extra second before you rush to absorb them back into that comfortable, familiar story of who you are.
Look, sitting in this gap does not always feel good. Actually, scratch that. It rarely feels good. But you know what it does feel like? It feels honest. And when our physical bodies and our internal narratives are constantly shifting around like the planks on the ship of Theseus, honesty might actually be the only true continuity we have left.
Which leaves us with this final, totally pressure-free thought. When you hold that pause, when you look at that stranger in the glass without any judgment and without rushing to recognize them, you create the space to ask yourself a very quiet, very profound question. Is this who I'm meant to become? The mirror, of course, is never going to answer you, but it will hold the question steady in whatever light happens to be falling. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, the next time you walk past a shop window, I really hope you take an extra second to meet the stranger looking back.